so much for being here today, and it's nice to see some familiar and friendly faces in the audience. I'm excited to have the opportunity to preview for you this book that I have coming out later this year. And once in a while when I'm on the road, I have a research assistant in the audience, and I'm very happy to say that Derek Houston gave me some fabulous support on this book, so I want to acknowledge him. I also want to acknowledge, before I even start talking about this work, that it represents a lot of people's work. And I know a lot of faculty say that, but when you look at what we've done here, you need to know that almost 200 people were engaged in the research that I'm talking about today, and that's the research team, along with about 3,000 students who gave us their time, and a great deal of funders and other folks who supported the work. So this is something I'm going to talk about, but not something that I did alone. This is the title of the book, and I'll give you the information at the end on where you can pre-order it. But what I want to do is first to start by talking a little bit about one of the young women that we met in this study. This is a longitudinal study in which we started with students when they were first entering college in the fall of 2008. And as part of this research, which I'll explain a little more about later, we've set up to do student interviews. Now, none of the students that I'm going to talk about am I using their real names, and I'm concealing some of their details, but nothing that would be salient to this story. So this young woman that I'm going to start with, we're calling Chloe Johnson. And I met Chloe for the first time. She looks an awful lot like the stock image. And I met her for the first time sitting in a school cafeteria at a technical college in Wisconsin. She had recently begun school there, having moved from a small town in central Wisconsin that had a small graduating high school class that was finishing high school at a time when the local paper mill in the town had just closed, and folks were going through a lot of layoffs. Her parents had recently gotten divorced. Her father had recently moved to Florida, and she had decided to go off to a technical college because she had grown up with a deep love of horses and wanted to learn how to work with them as a veterinarian. And so she selected her program based on this long-standing interest of hers in getting to know animals better and in treating animals. And so she went off to this college that I would call Midwest Tech, again, not its real name. We're trying to conceal some of the schools in the study as well for reasons that you will see. She came from a pretty low-income family. She qualified for the Pell Grant, which if you're not familiar with it, it is the nation's largest commitment to need-based financial aid. It's an entitlement program. And if you qualify for it based on your family's financial assets as well as income, then you can receive it. So her income, critically, is just over $25,000 a year at the time that she's starting college. And through a financial aid process that we call the FAFSA, some of you may be familiar with the FAFSA. I'll talk a lot about it in a little bit. She filled that out, and she received an expected family contribution of just over $2,500 a year. Okay? So she's not the neediest of the financial aid recipients out there. She's going to get a modest Pell Grant, but you can see that that is a pretty sizable contribution given a family, estimated family income of just over $25,000 a year. So I want to tell you a little bit about how she was thinking about things as she started college. One of the main questions that we began with students was, how did you decide to come to college? And she answered very honestly. She started with saying, I didn't know what I was doing. She just said, I knew that you get out of high school and you go to college. And in that way, she wasn't at all unusual. This is an age in which college is for all. That's what we're told. And she was informed by the people in her high school that the natural next step after high school was college, and so there she was. She also grounded her going to college in the economy. She felt that she couldn't get a job, and she quickly clarified a decent job, right, a stable job, that would pull her out of the kinds of jobs that she had been previously working at. Places like PetSmart, Kohl's, or McDonald's, she couldn't really get out of that for the rest of her life without going to college. And she said, it was okay for other people to do those kinds of jobs, but she couldn't see herself doing that, and she wanted to prevent it from happening, and that's why she went to college, right? So college was not really an opportunity for learning necessarily, but it was a preventative mechanism from keeping her from living the kind of life that she had had to live so far. And also she talked about the way in which her mom had had to live. So that was an important source of motivation motivation for her. All right, so that's Chloe, and we'll return to her in a little bit. I want to contrast Chloe with another gentleman named Ian Williams, who we met at the same exact time of year, and he went to a public university located in the city in which he was from. Now, this is his description of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He called the place he grew up a ghettoish type of neighborhood with a lot of violence. Now, if you're not familiar with Milwaukee, it is one of the most segregated and impoverished places in the nation, and that status is not improving. So if you get into my book, you'll find the entire chapter 8 is all about what I call the city of broken dreams, and try to explain to you what it is for students like Ian to grow up in a place where, frankly, they describe feeling very trapped in terms of their opportunities. So that is where he came up, and as the second youngest of 5 children, going off to a public university was a major success for his family. He had older brothers and sisters who had also tried to enroll in college, but didn't last very long, and one of them had entered a for-profit college and had not found that to be a very good experience. So he had big ambitions. He wanted to have a career in finance. He told us that he planned to go on for an MBA. He really wanted to make something of himself. And like Chloe, he had an average family income of around $25,000 a year. There were more mouths to feed in his family. However, as you can see from the family size, Chloe had just one younger brother. And so his expected family contribution was lower than hers at $425. He explained his rationale for going to college somewhat differently than Chloe did. He said that he had felt it in his heart that he really wanted to go to college, but he was never sure that he would make it. When he was in high school, he said, I keep on feeling like all I'm fixing to do is get through high school, and that's it. I'm going to get out of high school and have a full-time job paying my mother's bills and everything. Okay? So Chloe's focused on doing something different than she's done before in school. He is acknowledging that his future is going to be enmeshed with his family's, actually, for quite some time. And that he really wants better, but he's not sure if he's going to be able to do that. Now, sure enough, he finishes high school, and he doesn't actually immediately enroll in college. It isn't possible. He doesn't have the money. And so he takes a year off and works. But, as he says, somehow he manages to get back to college, to get back to his education just a year after graduating from high school. Just so you know, that's actually fairly uncommon. Well, Nick Kristof and others in the New York Times advertised that people should consider taking a gap year and explain as you'll be going off to Paris or to explore the world or doing some volunteer work in Malawi. For the most part, there is a significant social class gap in the gap year that means that people from low-income families tend to find their way to work and really not find their way back. But as he put it, somehow I managed to stay more focused on my education, and that's why I'm here in college right now. I've been through the struggle, and it made me stronger. Okay, so this is a guy who's really got a very strong sense of what he's doing there and why he wants to be there. Now, I want to put those prices that they're paying for college into some context, because you might wonder, are these unusual? Are these people that she's going to be talking about, are they representative of anything else? And I want to suggest to you that, in fact, they are. I'm going to do that by looking at 3 different prices. The financial aid system is very complicated, and it leads us to lots of prices. So the first price is the sticker price. And that's the sticker price as defined by federal methodology that the institution has. Okay? And that's going to be the black lines. The second price is going to be what we call the net price. And that's the price that the federal government right now, and Michelle Obama actually, are trying to get you to really focus on, which is the price that you'll pay after grants and scholarships. They're kind of saying to you, don't look at that sticker price, look at that net price, look, it's manageable. To think about what's manageable, I'm going to then give you a third way of thinking about it. And that's their net price as a percent of their family income at the time. Now, economists might tell me that's the wrong thing to do, that what I ought to do is percentage the price as a percent of their future income. Their future, once they have a college degree, what they're going to be earning, we ought to be putting it in that perspective. I'm not going to do that because that's not what students and families, particularly from low-income backgrounds, do. They look at their current resources and they look at the price and they assess their ability to pay that price. So, Chloe was attending a 2-year college, as I said, a public 2-year college in the state of Wisconsin, and the sticker price for that college was over $15,000 a year. This is in 2008. The net price for her much lower. One of the reasons is that it's not as if the two-year colleges are getting that much more in state appropriations. So it's not that much reduced. Also, when she sees her grant aid applied, she doesn't actually get very much. As I showed you, she only qualifies for a partial Pell Grant. And she got a partial state need-based grant. And I'm going to talk more about that later. When you percentage her resulting price as a percent of her income that I described earlier, it is 49% of her family's income for a year. Okay? Now, is that unusual? Well, these numbers, nationally, the sticker price for the two-year colleges at the time was a bit lower than that. Wisconsin was a little more of an outlier, and one of the reasons is that state appropriations are lower. That said, national averages for community college students don't mean very much. Nobody pays the national average. Okay? They pay what's there locally. And in this national conversation about community college prices right now, you hear a lot about how it's already free. The Wisconsin Hope Lab has taken a look at this, and it can tell you that if you live in California or Texas, it's mainly free right now. But if you don't, and we take those out of the national average, it isn't already free. It should help to illustrate the problem with thinking about this in a national average context. You want to think about it specifically to locally. Also, there's usually a little more grant aid for students elsewhere than there is in Wisconsin. But when we get to percentaging it as a percentage of income for folks like Chloe, who are Pell Grant recipients at community colleges, it is typically 42% of family income. So Chloe's a little worse off than the national average, okay? But not a ton more. Ian, on the other hand, matches the national average precisely, okay? So for a public university, for a Pell Grant recipient, he is looking at a price of $17,600, which nationally is $19,700, but his net price is just over $10,500. Okay? The national average net price is just over $11,000, and the percentage of his income is 43%, and that is exactly what it is for Pell Grant recipients at four-year universities nationally. Okay, so this should just give you a good sense, not only of how you can dissect price, but then how these two individuals stack up. All right, now how can we be in a situation where a person from a low-income family is facing a net price that high? We have to ask ourselves this, and we have to do it particularly because the intent of the financial aid that was created to help them was very different. Claiborne Pell was the senator who created the Pell Grant program. He's a senator from Rhode Island. And he said the following when he created the program: as a matter of federal policy, we should establish the right of every youngster, regardless of his family's financial circumstances, to obtain a post-secondary education. Now, I want to say his intent was to reduce, therefore, the linkage between family income and college attainment. I think the word obtain is a really important word in there. A lot of folks have talked about how the focus in this country has been on college access for a long time and said, it's very unfortunate that financial aid was never about completing college. I disagree. I think obtain suggests completion, and that the intent the entire time was, in fact, on obtaining the degree by making college sufficiently affordable that one could, in fact, finish. So what the heck happened? How can we move from the time in mid-1960s when Senator Pell is setting out those ambitions for the Pell program to a time when Chloe and Ian are facing out-of-pocket prices in the 40% range as relative to their family income? To understand what happened, first of all, we have to go back to some very basic facts about the higher education system that I think a lot of folks overlook. And if you've overlooked these, you shouldn't feel badly, because governors overlook them all the time. Governors who freeze tuition tell us that they've made college affordable, right? Well, cost of attending school goes well beyond tuition. What I have up here is the federal definition of the cost of attending college. It includes tuition and fees. It also includes room and board, which is a sort of term that works for people who live on campus, but I would rather replace with housing and food, right, or food and housing, partly because only 13% of undergraduates nationwide live on campus now and pay anything the equivalent of sort of room and board to somebody. So there's the food and the housing part. Then there's the books and the supplies part, which is very substantial and students talk about all the time. And those supplies include those really essential computers that some of us are taking notes on. Okay? It also includes transportation, which is not a small thing, again, given that only 13% of students are living on campus. It includes medical expenses. Now, certainly the ACA has made some strides in helping people to to deal with those, but there are lots and lots of things that come up, especially for folks who are from low-income families growing up. They get into adulthood, and then they really start to bear the consequences of the fact that their health has not been well taken care of when they were younger, and things start to essentially break down. We're seeing students with lots and lots of needs, both mental health and physical health needs. And then there are other personal expenses. Now, they're usually called just other personal expenses, but I want to drive the point home for you that this is an important thing for one's education. I recently visited a college in Miami, a community college campus in Miami, where I was speaking with a provost. And I said, tell me about your day. She goes, you know what I'm dealing with today? I have a professor who just called me to complain about a student who's disrupting class. I said, oh no, what did he do? She goes, he didn't do anything. He smells. He hasn't washed his clothes lately. The other students don't like it. They can't deal with it. Faculty member wants me to do something about it. So they're trying to figure out how they're going to bring this young man in and explain to him that they need to take his clothing from him so they can go wash it and bring it back to him. When we talk about personal expenses, we immediately, especially if we're financial aid officers or others, start to think about handbags, right? Or cell phones. Well, cell phones are no longer optional. In many cases, students are using these as their computers. They're trying to do homework right on the screen. Clothing's not optional. Okay? If you came in the classroom not wearing clothing, we would not be able to educate you. And if you came in the classroom and your clothing was not in decent shape and you hadn't been able to afford to do laundry, the provost might get called. Okay? So in order to successfully enroll in school full-time, students have to have these things. We know a lot of this in the K-12 space, but we look past it frequently in higher ed. So when you add all that up, you can see how things start to get kind of expensive. To spend your time, right, in school and not at work so you can pay for all of that stuff. Now, we are spending money, however, trying to help students to buy these things, to be able to afford these things. It wouldn't be right to say we just need to spend more money because we're spending a whole lot. When Senator Pell was speaking, we were spending annually $11 billion a year. And in inflation-adjusted terms, it's now $150 billion a year. So we are spending money. It's a question of what we're getting for our money. What's really happened is that the more that we spend, the less we seem to get. And so one way to illustrate this is by looking at the federal Pell Grant, but I could produce very much the same grant, it's very much the same chart for your Illinois grant, the map. Okay? The purchasing power of the Pell Grant when Senator Pell was speaking was nearly 100%, which means that it paid for a full year of college, a public 4-year. Okay? And it paid for more than a full year of college at a community college, which meant that the students had some additional money left over. Okay? That was back in the early 1970s. It has fairly steadily, without a little bit of exception there in the early 90s for the 2-year schools, pretty much just straight up declined. Okay? And so when we hear even President Obama talk about how he's raised the Pell Maximum, which he did do, right? During this time period, the Pell Maximum was increased, but it still bought less and less. Because the Pell Maximum is relative to the actual price, the sticker price of higher education. And that also keeps rising. Okay, so students are essentially getting less and less. And if you want to think about how that's irritating, think about what you would do if you bought what you thought was a Groupon for 75% off at a nice restaurant in town, only to go in and find out that it paid 25%. Okay? You're already in the door. The Groupon got you in the door. It just didn't buy you very much. And now you're scrambling to come up with the rest of the money. Okay, if Groupon did that, by the way, it would be illegal. But this is not illegal. This is done all the time. This is essentially a coupon with diminishing value. And the students don't realize how much it's diminished. All right, the other thing, and again, I know you know this, is that state support is substantially down as well. And what's fascinating about that is that state support, especially on a per-student basis, which is the dark yellow mustardy colored line, all right, is down as enrollment is up. And it actually begs some really interesting questions. I mean, we're spending generally more. And even post-recession, I mean, so there's some downward tick here, but Illinois and Wisconsin, we're actually a little unusual. Most places are starting to reinvest in higher education. But even as they spend more money, they're not spending more on a per-student basis. which makes you wonder whether, in fact, what's happened is states are actually, well, there's a lot of things that could happen that are political, right? But one of them is people are going to college now. We're not going to subsidize it like we used to because we don't want to, we don't feel the need to incentivize it like we used to. That's one way of putting it. It's also the case, though, that some of the places that have made the deepest cuts to per student funding are places that have the largest numbers of students of color, right? So there are a lot of dynamics happening here that also are contributing, therefore, to the rising price of higher education, because what happens is basically this. As funding per student declines, which is the blue line, tuition and fees in the public sector tend to go up. And so when you hear these statements about how the price of higher education is the real problem, why are these colleges and universities charging so much more? In the public sector, you get a very different set of explanations than those in the private sector. The private sector is having an arms race, right, around amenities. That's very, very clear. They are having a lot of issues where it appears that the availability of financial aid might actually be driving their prices up because they're trying to just figure out how much they can charge and then setting their price there. That's the story of the for-profits, and that's quite clear. But in the public sector, what drives the tuition and fees up is the cut to state aid. Whether they ought to be able, whether we ought to be able to control our prices so that when state funding goes down, we don't raise tuition, is an open question. But there's really no question about what manages to push tuition and fees up for students. It's state cuts. And here you can see, and this is just in the public sector, how much in inflation-adjusted terms these things have risen over time. So, even going back to 1975, we managed to keep, right, on an inflation-adjusted basis, we managed to keep community college prices fairly in check for quite some time. And then you can see post-2000 how much this rose, right? And this is what people are really reacting to. When we had a fairly stable price for, this is just tuition fees, room and board. By the way, I'm using College Board data. College Board data is what policymakers tend to use. It's the really highly respected source. There's one problem with it. It's omitting all the other stuff that I was showing you before. Books, supplies, transportation, medical expenses, and personal. So while this is at about a $6,000 line, you should add probably another $5,000 for all the other stuff. But this is just meant to show you change over time. People were clearly feeling this was fairly manageable somehow. Okay? But once it started to take off, they no longer were. And it's been taking off, as you can see, for the four-year sector for quite a while. Okay. The great tragedy, of course, is that as all of these things are happening, families look different than they used to and are experiencing a very different financial dynamic than they used to. So prices started to go up in the 1980s, but at the same time, most families, although especially the wealthiest families in the Reagan era, were getting ahead, right? They were seeing year-over-year growth in their family income. In the Clinton era, those prices were rising as well, but most families, again, were getting ahead. In fact, the growth was more shared. But in this more recent era, at a time when even the community college prices that are the places attended, especially by these bottom groups here, right, as those start to rise, we're at a time when everyone outside of the top 5% has either stagnant or declining real family income. That's part of the story. That's a big part of the story. So it is no longer the case that we can say, hey, at least especially through that safety net, which also eroded during this time, the poor are all right? Maybe it's the middle class. We can see here that the poor are not all right, nor are the middle class all right. And so finally, so many families are now in essentially the same boat, feeling that financially they're in real trouble at a time when college prices are rising faster than ever. And that, I think, is really what has spurred the incredible outcry that we're now hearing through multiple social movements about the rising price of higher education. So this is what it looks like, and why people say that they are really struggling. It is really true. These are the prices today by family income family income quartile for the people who are going to college. Okay? And this is, again, done as a percentage of their current family income, and it's done for the public 2 years and the public 4 years. For a point of reference, does anybody know the fraction of income that Americans typically pay for child care on an annual basis?
25%.
25? Okay, there's a lot of outcry about it, right? Everybody who's got kids is like, it is really unaffordable. Anybody got another guess?
Well, wouldn't it vary by the income?
It varies by the income a bit. It doesn't vary quite as much as this.
26%?
It's 7. It's 7. We scream about the unaffordable child care when it's 7% of our income. Okay? So when we're looking at 16% of family income to pay for a year of college, for the middle income folks, I think we can start to understand, not just for community college, right? I think we can start to understand when people are really upset. And why not only are the poor not all right, right? But the middle class is also not all right. These are basically the only folks here who we might argue you can manage, right? If you're making $142,000 a year, you can manage the $14,000 out of pocket to go to community college. But even when you get over there, look, they're needing us to pay $22,800 to go to a public four-year school on an annual basis. So for each of probably 4 or 5 years shelling out, we're borrowing the equivalent of 16% of their income for a year. So we need to start to have a conversation about what's reasonable. But the point here that I want to make is not only the size of these, but the differences across the income quartiles, so that you can really see that it would be wrong to, number one, assert that the poor are basically taken care of in this system, and also wrong to assert that the middle class really should have no reason to be upset. All right, this is just another way of showing change over time for these 4 quartiles. Now, in this case, this is the average net price across all colleges and universities. Okay, this one was not available just for the public institutions by net price. And what you can see, really importantly, is that a system that says it protects the poor the most has in fact protected the poor the least. Okay, that's the top line. Those are the poorest people in this country who get the most, supposedly, need-based financial aid. And their net prices have risen most steeply. Now, again, these are up. These are consistent with the last graph, right? And going from 21% for the near bottom to 35% is pretty substantial. But the idea that this means-tested, targeted, need-based aid is protecting the poor is clearly false, based on this graph, and virtually everything I've shown you so far. Okay, so the first question that I think we need to ask, and the question I've been really focused on for the last 8 years or so with my team, is would it help if we could get more grant aid to these students, right? Let's say we could increase the amount of aid that we got to them, even though that is a political challenge in and of itself, especially through a state or federal program. Would it help them? So let me tell you a little bit about the current study that I'm drawing on for this question. It's called the Wisconsin Scholars Longitudinal Study, and it's called that because what we did was we studied a program that began in the fall of 2008 called the Fund for Wisconsin Scholars that distributed a grant that we call the Wisconsin Scholars Grant. That's why it's got its title. And there have been decades of research on the effects of financial aid, so we were certainly not the first to try to figure out if grant aid helps students. I mean, not even close to the first. Decades and decades of research on this topic. But it's very, very difficult to figure out the independent effect of grants on students because people who get more money for college are very different than people who do not. Okay? It is a means-tested program, which means that it really does try to target the sorts of people whose likelihood of finishing college in the first place would be low. So if we simply compared Pell recipients and non-Pell recipients disproportionately grow up in neighborhoods that are troubled to begin with, in schools that are under-resourced, we would predict that they would have lower chances of college completion, and we would be wrong to attribute the Pell Grant to that lack of success, right? So what we really need is an experiment, and what we really haven't had is an experiment. And it makes a lot of sense that we haven't had an experiment, because experimenting with means-tested, need-based aid is a very difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do for ethical reasons. It's a difficult thing to do for political reasons, right? Nobody has ever been willing to experiment with the federal Pell Grant. And nobody's going to experiment with your map, okay? They didn't experiment with our Wisconsin grant. But these folks that we worked with were a private philanthropy that were faced with a really difficult situation. Even though they're extraordinarily wealthy and created a foundation to the tune of $175 million, that by no means could meet the needs of all of Wisconsin students who had financial need. In the year in which they created the program, there was $575 million of unmet financial need among the students of Wisconsin. That would have eaten their entire endowment in and of itself in a single year. What they wanted to do instead was they wanted to fund about $5 million a year in grants, and they wanted to figure out who to give them to. Now, figuring out who to admit to a college or who to give financial aid is a difficult decision, and we make it a difficult one, frankly, by trying to figure out who deserves what. We encouraged them, and they decided to go with the model in which they acknowledged that simply having need for college was enough. They didn't need to go further in sorting out the deserving from the undeserving. They would simply take all the students who had financial need, get those names from the financial aid administrators in the public sector around the state, put them all into a lottery, and pull the names of the people that they could award money to. And they wouldn't disappoint people. They wouldn't sign people up for the chance to get a grant and then tell half of them, no, sorry, you didn't win that lottery. Because that would be both a horrible thing to do, and by the way, really bad for research purposes. I mean, I have to admit, we would have disappointed a whole bunch of students. And we now have evidence, by the way, as well, that disappointing people will, in fact, impact their outcomes. So it wouldn't be a good thing to do. I'm really glad they didn't do that. What they did was they drew the winners, right, essentially the winners, and they notified them that they would be getting this money. And what they did was they engaged all of the 42 public 2-year and 4-year colleges throughout the entire state of Wisconsin. So take out of your mind immediately that this is a study about UW-Madison, because it's mostly not. And so they had 3,000 first-time, full-time Pell recipients. Now, that means, by nature of that kind of definition, first-time, full-time, that these folks are young. Their average age was just over 18, and they had pretty much come right out of high school, and they were fairly advantaged, actually, among Pell Grant recipients in that they were able to go to college full-time, right? So a little different than the typical Pell population. What they did for them was they offered the students at universities $3,500 a year, and they offered students at 2-year colleges $1,800 a year. Now, this is very, very common to offer the students at 2-year colleges less money. Okay? It's based on the assumption that 2-year colleges cost less. But as I was showing you before, they don't cost that much less. And so what this did was it cut the net price, right, the price after grants and scholarships. The students had already gotten their first financial aid package, then they got this money. It cut their net price from $8,000 to $4,500. Now, is $4,500 affordable? Well, what I want to tell you is that $4,500 is below the federal loan limits, right? So you can take government-backed, federally subsidized, and unsubsidized loans, and you could cover that $4,500. $8,000 is beyond that, right? You couldn't do that. So in that sense, it probably rendered it somewhat affordable. At the 2-year colleges, it only cut the net price from $9,800, which is higher to begin with, for reasons I was showing you with Chloe and Ian, because she got less granted, to $8,000. Still far above federal loan limits. So what's important about that is that in a typical aid study, all they would tell you was that the 2-year college students got $1,800. And you wouldn't really know from the context of the study whether that was a lot or a little. So I'm telling you it's $1,800 and it doesn't buy that much, right? So as you think about effects, you have to think about that part. The other thing is, the students, when they were coming to college, they didn't know about this. So this is not a study of the effects of that financial aid on their decision to enroll. It's a study of the effects of financial aid on how they do in college. And as I said before, they were entered into a lottery, and the real question was, if we tell the students that they can get this additional money for college, will they stay in college longer and complete college at higher rates? And so the grant would stay with them for up to 5 years. If they transferred colleges, by the way, they could also get the higher amount. But in order to do that, they had to go to their new college and tell them they were getting this grant at their old college and file the paperwork so they could get that. So we tracked these students, these 3,000 students, over the following 6 years. We got their financial aid applications and their financial aid packages. We got their academic records. We got their National Student Clearinghouse records, which is a system that allows us to track them across schools, across the country if need be. So if these students left Wisconsin, we were able to then follow them in that sense. We also repeatedly surveyed them. We did so in very large surveys that you will see yielded a lot of very interesting data that were very tricky to do because students don't tend to like to respond to surveys. So we employed heavy incentive strategies, and we got in our first survey a 75% response rate from Pell Grant recipients. So we continued to survey them and interview them over time. we drew a stratified random sample of 50 students at 6 of the 42 colleges and universities. Over 1,000 students volunteered for interviews out of that 3,000. So we were able to then construct a table of their characteristics and draw from within those cells who we wanted to interview. And we then started to interview these students, usually every 6 months to a year for the next 6 years. And we also followed them whether or not they stayed in school. So we didn't, many colleges and universities will talk to their students only until they drop out, then they're just gone. We were especially interested in the students who were gone and why they had left. Okay. So let's fast forward to the end of that time period and take a look at the impacts of that grant aid. I can do this analysis in a fairly straightforward way by simply comparing the people who were offered the additional money to the very comparable group of people who were not, right? And in papers that are widely available, in fact, one's coming out in the American Journal of Sociology next month, you can see all about how randomization took place, how it was what we call happy randomization, which means that it worked, and how we do these estimation strategies. It doesn't always work, I have to warn you. I've now done a lot of randomized control trials and find them to be exceedingly difficult things to do well. So, the story for the 2-year students, as you can see here, because there really are no stars or anything like it, and these are point estimates with confidence intervals around them. The story is that we didn't see much. To our great disappointment, right, and frankly counter to some of the literature out there, offering these students some additional money did not seem, at least over the following years, and we estimate these over 3, but we followed them over 6, there really weren't any real changes. We do the 3 because it's the standard 150% time to completion that the federal government puts. Sometimes things look to be a little bit better, but we don't actually approach significance. So any degree completed, right, I mean, this estimate, the control and treatment are very, very similar, and the confidence interval reaches outside it, so you would hope that, you know, maybe there'd be something there, but we have decent sample sizes of students, and we really saw nothing. However, for the university students, we did. And I think there's a couple of things here that are interesting. So you look at the retention to the 2nd year of college, and it did appear that retention rates went up, although we couldn't be quite sure, right? It was still possibly due to chance alone. And that was kind of the story for a while. Like, if you talked to me in 2010 or 2011, I was starting to talk about findings, and I was honestly saying that we had some indications that students might have been doing a little bit better in terms of improvement in college and their academics, but we weren't seeing a whole lot. What was fascinating, though, was that in the surveys, we were starting to see some differences. We were seeing differences of students in their work behaviors. And we were hearing from them that the grant money mattered to them. Importantly, I want to note that when we ask people what matters to them, we don't go out and say things like, how does the Wisconsin Scholars Grant matter to you? Right? I actually think that's a lousy way to do evaluation of a program. If what we're interested in is, does college feel more affordable, then what we do is we approach an interview and we say, how's college going? And then we let the student lead us into how college is going. They will inevitably start talking about price. I guarantee you. Stereotypes of students would say they'd start talking about boyfriends and girlfriends. That's nonsense. They talk about price. These students talk about price all the time. And as they talk about price, what we were interested in was whether they ever started talking about the program. Right? And so through that, I can tell you that some of them did. So we had these early indications that things might be going well, but nothing was really showing up. But as we all know, especially educators know, education is a cumulative process. And when things start to click, things start to happen. Well, lo and behold, we have improved bachelor's degree completion rates over 4 years for the students who were offered the additional grant support. This is a statistically significant effect that increased the 4-year graduation rate from 16% to 21%. It's fairly sizable. If we translate that into the dollars spent, it's an effect size very consistent with non-randomization studies of financial aid. And like I said, the American Journal of Sociology will be covering that very soon. However, I look at those numbers, and especially as somebody who really thinks about making college affordable and what it can and cannot do, I wonder about the fact that almost 80% of these Pell Grant recipients still did not complete a degree, right, over those 4 years, even with this additional money. And I have to ask myself, does that mean that money doesn't matter? And having having done this study and worked with those students that whole time, I can absolutely tell you there's no doubt in my mind that money matters to them. Money is what they talk about. The financial aid, however, was not getting it done. So that's what I want to move to now. We really wanted to emphasize that for you, right? We're really going to zoom in. 16 to 21. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. I think the naive observer of the financial aid system would say, hey, it's about cash for college. If I wanted to give you cash for college, then I would open my wallet and I would toss you some money and you would put it into your wallet and take it home. Okay, that is not what today's financial aid system is doing. Today's financial aid system is a complicated policy with an incredible set of practices that are regulated with the financial aid officers with a stack of over 4,500 regulations. Okay? It involves lots and lots of things that happen to that money during that time. And so let me tell you about some of the things that happened to that money that those students were supposed to receive. The first is that the ones that were supposed to get $3,500 or $1,800, they often didn't. Okay? They were already in college, they had a financial aid package, and there are these rules about how much money they're allowed